In today's video, paint along with me as we paint a beautiful watercolour Magnolia bud. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolour as well as drawing, mixed media, even a little bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's completely free. If you click the little bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. I do at least one free video a week here on YouTube. Now we're going to start this tutorial from a place of already having done the background, but don't worry, there's a separate tutorial for that. I'll link to that one in the description of this video, or you can just put it in the YouTube search description with my name and you should come across it. You'll also find it in the step-by-step playlist. And I'm going to take you through this really simple painting. You're going to be amazed at the beautiful results that you can get. We're going to start by choosing the colours, but don't worry if you don't have the exact same colours as me, because you can always use others. I'll give you options. I'll also be using a watercolour pencil. Again, this isn't vital. You can always put those fine details on with a small brush at the end. So don't let that stop you from picking up your paintbrush and having a go. As always, I like to work within a limited palette for each painting, and so many of you have told me that you're really interested in this process of how I choose those colours. So let's do that first. So I've decided to start this tutorial with just 4 colours. It's always important, I feel, within any painting to start with a limited palette. Don't restrict yourself to how many colours that might be, just choose the amount that you need. I'm going to go through why I have chosen these particular colours. Now the first colour I've chosen, I want this pink obviously. I've chosen Quinacridone Magenta. Normally I would take several of my pinks and swatch, look for one that was kind of blue leaning like this one is. In other words, one that doesn't have a sort of a peach effect as some permanent roses do. Now the reason I'm not swatching loads of these is because I've just been using this in a garden painting, and I've just taken this photograph over and sort of laid it next to it, and I can see straight away that it's just the right colour, as I would expect a Quinacridone Magenta to be. So let's put a little bit of that on the paper. So you can see that without much water, it goes really, really dark. But as we water it down, look at that. It's really just the perfect colour. Now let's think about some of the other colours. Now I've got sort of this blue-grey in the background, and I've got some green here, sort of a dull green. Now if I weren't doing the background, if I were just doing the flower bud as I had previously expected to, I might well choose just a ready-made green, something like a chrome oxide. I'd just swatch a few of my greens. Wouldn't really be any point to me mixing a green. However, I need to do the background in this as well. And I'm looking at the background and thinking, well, I could choose a Payne's Grey, which would be a really good shade watered down. But to me, there's almost like a bokeh effect here. I love the idea of sort of lifting out some areas. Now, to use a staining pigment like Payne's Grey is going to make that difficult. So I think if I want a blue-grey in the background, it's far better for me to mix it. This blue here tends towards one of the more yellow, warmer blues. You could use something like a phthalo, but again, that's too strong. So I'm going to choose this Cerulean blue. This is one of my favourite brands. Now, Cerulean blue really, really does vary. If you're going to spend money on any pigments, spend it on your Cerulean, because the cheap ones are awful. Let's have a look at this. It's a very delicate, granulating colour, but unlike ultramarine, it granulates in a very soft, delicate way, so it never looks too heavy. I've got a little bit of the pink left on my brush there, I think. I know you're all going to moan at me in the comments for putting my brush directly into the tube of paint. What can I say? I like to live dangerously. So there's my Cerulean, and I can combine it with this pink and with some yellow to make all sorts of neutrals. So I'm going to need that third primary. I'm going to need a yellow, and you can see here we've got these warmer areas here where we might need a little bit of yellow, and obviously to mix our dull green we're going to need a yellow. I'm rather taken by the idea of using one of the nickel-based yellows or one of the opaque yellows. So I've got here some old SAA paint. Now this one is actually from their old range. They've reformulated, so I can't say it's exactly the same. I was looking for a pigment number on it, and strangely I couldn't find it. It just says nickel titanate, which means it's going to be pretty much probably the same as this one here, which is Jackman's, also nickel titanate. We could use either of these. They're probably going to be quite similar. Let's try swatching them. I'm inclined to use the SAA one just because I want to use it up, to be honest, but let's have a look at it anyway. Luckily there's a load of it on the outside here. I can just grab some from the outside. Look at that. Okay, so it's not as strong, but that could just be because I'm not getting the full paint. Let's take the lid off that one. It's starting to squeeze out a little. I haven't used it for a while, so a little bit of the gum arabic has gone up to one end. So let's give it a proper trial by grabbing it like this. So there, it's a lot stronger and it seems to be a little cooler than the Jackman's one. Now another option I've got is this Naples Yellow Light. So Naples Yellow is another colour that is very notorious for being slightly opaque. So let's have a look at this one. I would expect it to be warmer than the other two though, because Naples Yellow in its standard form has got a slight sort of opaque orangeness to it. So let's swatch this one. It's slightly warmer, there's not a lot in it. So let's try combining this and seeing what we can make. There we are, we can easily make a green. And if I mix it with a bit of pink, you'll see that that starts to dull it down. We get these three primaries working together. We start to get neutrals. If I go heavily onto the blue pigment, I'll start to get greys. I actually think any of these yellows would work. I'm going to use the SAA one simply because I've got the most of it. And it's a nice bright light colour. I think actually to go a little bit cooler with this will be advantageous. So let's look at the colours we've chosen so far. So I've basically got three primary colours. Now I can pretty much mix everything from them except for one thing, and that's this brown here. Now certainly I can mix a brown from my three primaries. However, browns often don't look that great when you mix them yourself, and certainly I won't be able to get a very strong brown. That's because the blue pigment I've got is a weak pigment. So I'm going to actually choose a brown to add to these three. And the one I'm choosing is this one here. Ignore the duct tape. It somehow ended up with a strange little hole in it. Let's swatch this one for you. So here is Sepia. Now do be aware that these vary a lot between brands. Some of them are much warmer than this and some of them are more grey. This is the Talens Rembrandt and it's one of my favourite colours. Look how beautiful it is to get those light colours. Nevertheless, if we do it more strongly, you can see that it's a strong staining colour. So we have this colour here that's very dark, this colour here that's very dark. That's going to balance up with those two weaker colours, give us the full range we need for this painting. Having said that, I do reserve the right to grab another colour as I go through. I don't think I'm going to need it. You should never handcuff yourself to a limited palette. It's meant to serve you, not to restrict you. So if I get to a point in the painting where I think these colours here can't mix exactly what I need, then I'll add another one in. So I've added a couple more things in here. Now, forgive me if there are any continuity errors, any changes of nail varnish or rings or anything like that, or if I repeat myself because I'm filming many different things at the moment and sort of dropping things in and out. We're going to concentrate on the flower today. So what I've added here, I've got a watercolour pencil and I've sharpened it quite a lot. So we're going to use this. You can see we've got some distinct lines in here and it's far easier to draw these with watercolour pencil than it is to paint them. However, if you don't have any watercolour pencils, of course you can just paint the petal as I'm going to show you, and then right at the end you can draw on some lines with a very tiny paintbrush, but do that at the end, not on the way through as I'm going to be doing with this. And what we'll be able to do is to wet an area. I've just been swatching colours for various other tutorials on this as well, and we'll be able to just draw it in like that. Look at those beautiful soft fine lines. You would not be able to do that with a paintbrush. If you do use a paintbrush, use your very tiniest one. Another option, if you're used to doing that, is to use the knife scoring technique, which I've shown you in other videos. And before we start on the main part of the colour, and I always like to do the flower first, I'm going to drop some shadow in. So I'm going to mix up a shadow colour next. I'm just going to use the colours I've already got out in my palette. So I want to mix a grey, but it's going to be a warm grey. I want it to tend more towards lilac or warm grey than I do a blue grey. And I've already got some sort of lilac paint mixed up here, which is majority blue. And I may just start with this actually. And what I'm going to do is drop some yellow in, and yellow is the third primary, so we're going to neutralize this color somewhat. And you see we can just start getting this lovely shadowy color. Let's have a little bit more of that in. I'm just going to swatch this. Now the color that your shadow color is going to depend on the color your flower is. So this color here is fine for a pink flower, but I could actually go, and I may go a little bit more into the lilac. If it was a white flower, I might allow it to go more green. If it was a yellow flower, I'd definitely go more lilac because I don't want the yellow flower turning into green unless I choose to have that. On a white flower, you can pretty much choose your own shadow color. But you always want to make sure you're mixing your shadow color from the colours that are already in your palette so that it remains harmonious. I'm pretty happy with that. So we're going to start by dropping some shadow in, and I'm erasing any lines that I no longer need. Now I have the background in, I don't need this outer line here, and I'll take these lines here a little bit fainter as well. Remember that I always go darker if I'm on YouTube, just so people can see properly. What I'm going to do is I want to get a bit of shadow up here, so I'm just going to bring some clean water up. I'm not going to worry about down here because it's going to be very dark anyway. I'm going to start painting these petals in layers, and the first thing I'm going to do is drop a little shadow in. The actual edge of the flower is quite white, so I'm going to sort of almost stop it before I get to the edge of that petal. Do not overdo this because you don't want it going too dark, and see how it just fades in nicely because we have that pre-wet area. There may be some areas where you see as being full shadow. For instance, this little bit in here, I think with this, I'm just going to paint the shadow completely over that area because it's inside, it's an inside part of the petal. It's gone a little bit dark there, so let's just add some water while we're going in because we do want it to look different from the background. That's fine. I'm going to drop a little shadow in, probably on this petal here and this one. This one up the top here is so dark pink that I probably won't worry about doing that one at all. So now's the time to drop a little shadow in. Remember to wet with clean water first so that you don't get hard edges, and don't just wet near where you're putting the paint. Take the water, as much as halfway down a large petal like this to just ensure that you don't come off the edge of that water. When you put the shadow colour on, make sure it's not too wet, and in this way you'll be able to manipulate it and it won't spread too far. As soon as you get wet paint hitting damp paint, you get sort of this kind of effect, this feathering effect, which can look very pretty, but I'm not seeing it on this particular plant. Now, do you see here I've gone off the edge of the water? We can easily fix that by getting a damp, not wet paintbrush and just blending that area there. It is possible to do this technique by going onto dry paper and then blending the edges, but let me assure you that's a much harder method. If you can, wet first, and notice how I'm putting the shadows in wherever the petal curves and possibly where it goes in and behind things, although there's such a strong dark pink down here that I won't worry about doing that in this case. So pretty happy with that. It's a very subtle effect, but you can see we're already getting this idea of 3 dimensions coming in. I'm going to now do something with candle wax. What I'm going to do is to rub some of this on here. There are some tiny little white speckles on here, but they're far too soft for masking fluid, so I'm going to do those with the candle wax. Do have a practice of this technique if you haven't used it before. It's rather hit and miss, and you can't really see it until you put some paint on it. And I want you to use an older brush for applying paint over this as well. If you don't have candle wax, and I'm going in with the sepia here, let's take it across here. If you don't have candle wax, then I do recommend oil pastel, and especially with oil pastel, use an old brush. I'm just taking a sort of an underneath layer of colour here that we can work on top of later on, just to see how that candle wax has taken. Pretty good. Pretty happy with it. There isn't much way of removing it if you put too much on, so be careful. Worst case scenario, you can put some paper towel over it and press it with an iron, but actually I'm quite happy with that. So I'm using 2 water jars here in order to keep one full of clean water, and what I'm going to do here is take some water in. We're going to work on each petal individually, so make sure that the petal next to it is always dry. Taking water up the top here. What we're going to do then is go straight in with this Quinacridone Magenta. I'm picking it up with a fairly dry brush, picking up quite a lot of pigment because this is a very dark petal. I'm going to take it in here. So at the bottom here, I'm on dry paper, and next to the petal next to it that's got dry paper, and I'm going to come up like this. If you can hear any crazy noises in the background, do forgive me. My pet cat, Gimlet, has unexpectedly come back to live with me. I'm sure you don't understand any of that, but basically he's been living apart from me for the last 2 years, though I have visited him on a weekly basis, and I've just been allowed to bring him back to my house. So sweeping in there with that damp brush, we're fading this petal out. Now, whilst it's still wet, and before Gimlet starts shouting at me again, let's bring this in here. Look at that, really happy with that effect. Some of the others have less magenta on, but they're all going to be painted in a similar way. This one down here, however, is pretty much all magenta. So we can, with this one, just really go straight in. As I said, make sure the petal next to it is dry, because otherwise you'll lose that nice crispness between the petals. And we're not really going for a loose, distant effect here. So we need to paint each petal individually. Now, do you see here, we have a colour that's almost brownish orange. You want to be very, very careful to keep brown away from flowers in the main, at least on the petals. But we're going to go for a little bit of this orangey brownish red colour. I'm going to mix it up in advance. You can see it's kind of got bluey purple. It almost looks like a bruise, doesn't it? So what I'm going to do is get my pink and mix in some yellow. And obviously we start to get more of an orangey colour. Let's put a bit of blue in, see what happens. Not bad at all. I think I'm going to make it a bit stronger because by the time it gets watered down, as I add tiny amounts to my paper, it'll be a bit fainter. At this point, if you're enjoying this tutorial, if you're getting some value from it, if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, can I please ask you to press the like button? That's the thumbs up button. It just sends a signal to the YouTube algorithm that this is a good video. And if you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I can help teach more people to paint and draw. It will also enable me to keep making free videos like this one for you. So I think that colour's fine. If I put more blue in, it would eventually become grey, which I don't want. I'm just going to add a touch of this as I put the magenta in on the next petal. So working with a bigger brush here, taking water across, but not going right to the edge with it. And not going to the edge of these petals either, because that will mean that we won't be able to see where the water's going if we go too close to those pencil lines. Want to take it down there with the paint. I'm going to actually apply it this time with the larger brush as well, because that's going to mean that I can get the colour on quickly, which is important. Coming up like this. You see it bleeding up, that's because the paint's quite wet. I'm not worried here because I do need it to travel up, but if it does that too much, just dry your brush and suck up some of the water from the surface of the flower. And just coming up like this, drying my brush there a bit because there's too much water there. I've got a really red part here, so I'm just going to go in literally with almost dry paint, pop that in, changing back to the smaller brush. We're going to get a little bit of this other colour in here. Got some puddling going on here, so rinsing and drying my brush. Hello Gimlet, welcome to YouTube. Can you hear him meowing? He's just harassing me non-stop, and who knows what he wants because all of his needs are catered for. But that doesn't stop cats, so I'm going to bring this up here now and get some of these fine lines. You don't want to work on this too long. Remember to take those lines up and out and follow the line of your petal. Don't worry if you get mistakes or drying lines. You can just let it dry, then go over the top with another layer. I'm going to try and get it done as much as I can in one though. Once it gets to this stage of being semi-dry, leave it alone. I'm going to paint this petal next because I don't want to touch any petals that are touching the first one. We must let those dry. So let's paint this one over here, taking that very strong colour up and out. Rinsing and drying my brush, coming in like this, spread this down, and then a few watercolour pencil lines, just faint ones. And I'm just also going to use the watercolour pencil to just tidy up this edge here. I'm trying to keep my hand out of the way so that you can see. Don't worry if you go across an edge and change the shape of a petal slightly, nobody is going to know. Ordinarily, I would wait longer before painting this petal, but it's got actually a white edge to it, which means I don't have to take the paint so that it touches this large petal here. So I'm going to put, again, clean water on, not going right up to the edge. There's actually quite a lot of that sort of brownish colour on this. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the pink here, rinse my brush, and we'll go in and get some of this colour here and come up like this. And you can adjust it if you want to, if you think it looks a little more yellow in places or a little more blue, you can just pop that in. And I think we've just got a hint of one or two lines here. There are also areas here, if you look, you can see it's folded in, so there's a darker part there. You can get that by going in with pretty much dryish paint and just popping that in, or if you think it's got a little bit of the other colour in. You need to make sure the paint you go on with is pretty dry, otherwise it'll bleed uncontrollably. Just going to blend slightly with a damp brush because it's starting to dry now and I need to leave it alone. I'm just going to get this edge a little bit stronger here, like so. Let's mix some of that yellowish green up now. I'm not too worried about getting a bit of pink in it because it's a fairly dull colour anyway. It almost looks like, you know, it's got a bit of this colour here in and some yellow. They're quite opaque, these little buds, and that's why I picked such an opaque yellow. So again, clean up the pencil, and then we're just going to pop that in. We can define those with a bit more shadow in a moment, but for now, I'm just going to paint them on like this. Whilst those are drying, let's get our final petal in. Again, I'm not going too close to the edge. Apart from anything else, red in particular, and I include pink in that, tends to bleed if you paint near it. So I'm going to avoid going right up to the edge with that water or with the colour particularly. And coming down like this. Again, taking the paint fairly dry. If you get too much water on your brush, just dry it on a rag or some tissue paper. I have some just off camera. And come in like this. Don't think I drew the bottom of that petal there. Let's just put that in and bring this up. Going in for some of this duller colour here. I feel like on this one there's almost a touch of lilac-y blue here, so I'm going to put a bit more blue in. Just drag some of that colour up, and again using my watercolour pencil, make sure that you're following the lines, the shape of the petals. See how it's helping them to look three-dimensional. And just with a clean damp brush, I'm just going to clean up that edge there so it's not so harsh. And I'm just going to get a little bit of an idea of that petal having a bit of shape to it there. And I think we'll get a bit more of that neutral colour. And again, we're going to let that dry. So this here, which is part of the, what I imagine was the bud, looks very soft and feathery. I'm not going to worry too much about that texture, although we can imitate some of it by letting some bleed lines happen. It starts here sort of greenish and then goes more into the sepia. Again, let's clean up that pencil a little, coming in with a touch of green. Now we've got some of the candle wax there, so that's stopping that adhering, but I'm absolutely fine with that. And as I come up here, I'm going to put some clean water on, because let's try and get some of that feathering. I'm keeping that water away from that pink as well, because it'll bleed into there. So we put some clean water on. What you want to do then is let it get sort of semi-dry, so just a moment or two, so that we're going on with paint that is wet now. So the paint is wetter, and what should happen is we should get some bleeding and furring happening. And then almost repeating the process with darker paint. And starting to get a little bit of detail down here. I'm also going to go in here between the petals with some really dark paint, just so that we start to get that definition around the base there. I'm going to put some more colour on this stem here. So I'm going in with the sepia, but in places it's a little warmer. It's got a little yellow in, so let's get that in too. Just allow that to mix in. Possibly even a bit of the pink. I mean, it's not the ideal colour. I'm trying to stick to my limited palette here, rather than going and finding, you know, something of a warmer, more orange brown. Do you see how it's darker down one edge and also under the buds? That's going to help it look three-dimensional. So with a fine brush, pick up some of that dark colour, and while it's damp, we're just going to run that down the side and slightly under the buds. There's a touch of horizontal sort of definition lines on this stem. They could be done with watercolour pencil. I'm just being lazy and not wanting to turn the camera off, so I'm just going to do them with my paintbrush. Again, make sure this paint is thick and sticky. and that will ensure that it stays pretty much where you put it. See how it's drying there, so we're getting a bit of a hard edge. I'm just going to get a damp paintbrush and just soften that in. Now the edge down here had become too sharp, too white, so what I'm doing is I'm dropping some clean water down the edge of it because all that feathering had disappeared. So let's make it happen again by putting clean water in and allowing it to bleed. So let's go back up to the flower and see if there's anything else needs doing. I've got this little area here which is actually a separate little bit of petals, so I'm going to pop that in. Now everything's dry there, so going in here like this. Let's not make that too dark, otherwise it will look like part of the one next to it. And you want to think about later on when you rub these pencil lines out, are there any areas, and they won't rub out entirely, especially for me because I'm having to work darker for YouTube, but are there any areas where it's not really showing up well against the petal next to it? Might be time to drop some more shadow in, so let's re-wet this little bit here. And I'm just going to get a little bit of stuff from my palette and just drop down that edge there so that it shows up a little more. We also, of course, need it to show up against the background, which may be darker or lighter than the petal, so you have to take that into account. So I'm just going to do a little bit of artistic license here and drop some pink down the edge of that because I want it to show against the background there. This one here I'm happier with, but I think it could do with a little bit more definition. Let's pop a little bit more shadow in there. This time I'm going on dry paper, and just with a clean damp brush I'll just take that out to the edge there. And I think this edge here is not showing very well, so again let's put a bit of shadow along there. Generally, not always, but generally you want to take shadow behind petals rather than in front of. You also may have areas like this where we've got a little bit of a hard edge there, so I'm just going to take a damp brush and just give that a bit of agitation. Be careful when doing this, you can leave watermarks, but it's so little paint there that I think we'll get away with it. You can also, if you want to, find any areas that you think need to be a little bit darker and go in with paint or with your watercolour pencil, which may be a little bit easier. You can come around here like this. If you do go back in with paint, you may need to re-wet the whole petal, and if you do that, start with the lightest area and come down with the water. If you take the water here and up, you'll drag all of this pigment up here. I'm actually pretty happy with how that flower looks so far. So let's work some more on these areas here. I've got a little bit of the cerulean and the yellow here and just coming in like so. Now this limited palette is stopping me from making very dark greens because we don't have a dark blue, but because we've got a lot of brown in this picture, I think we can have a little bit of artistic license and take some brown in here. You can use a darker blue or a darker brown if you find it helpful. I'm going to take that down there. There's also on this one over here a strong hint of this shadowy colour that we made, and I'm going to go a little darker with that. Now you might look at my palette, things like my yellow, and think, well, you're not painting very cleanly, Michelle. It's kind of a matter of whether it matters or whether it doesn't. If I'm about to paint something that's green, for example, I do not want any of this pink in. I would clean that off. If I'm going to paint something that's pure yellow, again, I will clean that up. If I need some pure blue, then I'm going to squeeze some out. So it's a matter of, considering what's best. These paints have been dried for some time. They're drying overnight. So it's just a matter of judgment, what you're doing next, how dry your paint is, how much it's going to be messed up if you go on top of it with a dirty brush. Because you can go too far and just end up with water everywhere when you keep cleaning your brush and your palette. I'm going to make some more of the yellow and the pink because there's a definite hint of it in the buds, and we can use it to get a little bit of shading around them. So I can go sort of around the top and the base here, and then just with clean water I can join those areas up like so. And of course you can also do it the other way around, so you can go on with a clean brush like this with water, and then you can pop that next colour in. If you're not an experienced painter, I'd advise doing it this second way. It's much easier. Again, with a bit of artistic license, I'm going to use my pink pencil just to get a touch more definition on these, simply because we don't have the ability to make a very dark green or a very dark orange because of the palette that we're working with. Take care not to outline, the whole of an area. can look very fake, but just in one or two places, a little bit of watercolour pencil can give all of the definition that you need. So as I make these final touches, putting a little sepia on this one because it does look a little browner. Really happy with the results I've got here. Remember, you don't need to do the background in this tutorial. It will look absolutely lovely on white paper, which was how I was going to do it at first, but you all wanted the background tutorial, so I included that as well. But it's not actually necessary. Very last thing I'm going to do is just catch this little bit of fluffiness on the edge of the bud here. And if you want to adjust any areas, I mean, I could put a little more dark on this, for example. I can go on top with clean water. This is completely dry now, so I'm going on top with clean water and just repeat whatever processes I was doing before. So there's one more thing to do to this, well, two if you include signing it. I need to take an eraser across it to get rid of any more pencil line that I can get off, but I'll do that after it's dry. Remember, very strong paint like this can be moved with an eraser even after it's dry, so do take care. Come onto the dark areas with your eraser rather than smudging outwards. Now, if you'd like to share your painting with other amateur and professional and semi-professional artists, do pop over to my Facebook group. We have lots of beginners in there, but we also have some quite experienced artists. It's the friendliest group on the internet, I absolutely promise you. And I'd love to see what you make of this painting. And do let me know in the comments if there are any other simple tutorials that you'd like me to paint for you. I'll also be doing some simple drawing subjects, so again, let me know what you would like me to draw, because this year it's all about deep diving into these small little subjects so that you can really improve your skills. Now, before you leave this video, don't forget to look in the video description. Any videos I've spoken about in this one will be referenced down there. You can also grab some free downloadable PDF guides. There's even a free watercolour painting course. If you enjoyed this video and you're quite new to watercolour painting, I've got some really fun techniques that you can try next. You can watch that video right now.